Okay, now we're going to talk about JavaScript classes. Remember, the class syntax is just syntactic sugar. What do I mean by syntactic sugar? It means it's just a different way or a nicer way of doing the same thing, that the syntax is a little bit easier or it's more recognizable to certain people. So it's just a different way of doing the exact same thing. So when JavaScript scans this, we have the class keyword in JavaScript, which is relatively new. In the last 10 years or so. Then we have the name of the class, which is person in this case, and then we specify the constructor. So right away you see the similarities from our previous constructor functions, except in the constructor function itself, that's basically this portion, and we still use this just like we did there. Okay. So in this particular case, the constructor takes in arguments. Here we're going to say that's just a list of arguments. I just have this in here as a common way to show how you can do defaults. You'll see this in JavaScript a lot. So in JavaScript, if you have an array and you try to access a value from the array, you just get the value undefined. So what's the value stored in this array at index 0? If there is a value, you get that value. If there's not, you get the value undefined. So it's a little different than other programming languages, where a lot of times you would get an index out of bounds error here. So you would have to make sure that there is enough items in that array in order to access the first item. So we would have to have a length of 1 in this case. In JavaScript, you don't. So this is returning undefined. And this is a Boolean operator, right? So we're doing Boolean OR. And the way Boolean operators work in JavaScript, JavaScript uses coercion to change types as needed. So undefined and Boolean OR doesn't make sense unless undefined is converted to a Boolean value. So undefined as a Boolean value is false. So we call undefined a falsy value. If we open up Node, there are several falsy values, right? So we can, a quick way of converting something to a Boolean is to negate it twice with Boolean operators. So we could say what's not of undefined, right? So it's false, it's falsy. When converted to a Boolean, it is falsy. What are some other falsy values? We have quotation marks, that's false. But if I have something in there, that's true. So that's a truthy value. That's what we mean when we say falsy or truthy. It has to do with JavaScript coercion of types. All right, so null is falsy. 0 should be falsy. So there's several values that are falsy. And when that's the case, you can use this sort of syntax. If this exists, right, then that's going to be truthy, presumably. Now you can get into trouble if the value is like integer 0, but in our case, this should be a string. So if there's a value, use that value. When JavaScript evaluates Boolean values, if one is truthy, the result isn't just the value true, the result is that value. Okay, what do I mean by that? So we have let Boolean value equal cat or false. So this is a Boolean expression. One of these is truthy, cat, and so as soon as JavaScript recognizes a truthy value with an OR statement, it's just going to return that truthy value. So B is going to be cat. Right? Or I could just type B. Okay, so it doesn't return, like in other programming languages, JavaScript doesn't necessarily return true and false. It just returns the thing that was truthy. Now there are some advantages to that. You can have this interesting syntax, stuff like this, but there are downsides as well, as it can be a little confusing if you don't understand how JavaScript works. All right. So in a similar way, we could say that B equals false or cat. Okay, so and here that's not true in the OR statement, so it has to go ahead and try to evaluate this, and that is true. So again, I declared B twice. So again, the value should still be cat. And also notice here with this statement, we have an assignment statement. The output was cat. That's because after an assignment statement, a value is returned in JavaScript. This is unlike most other programming languages, right? So I can do something like let A equal B equal false, right? So JavaScript does sees that cat is truthy, so it returns that and sets it equal to b. But this assignment statement also returns the value that was stored, so that's going to be cat, and so a is set equal to cat as well. And you can do this multiple times. This is kind of interesting, but it can also lead to undesired behavior if you don't know that JavaScript does this. Okay, so it's very important that you're aware of that. So we have, in this case, A is going to be cat just like B. All right, and so now we have, we understand what this argument is. The syntax, this is the spread operator on arguments, and then this is accessing one of the values if it exists, right? It could be undefined. If it exists, then we set that value equal to this dot first. If it does not, we have a default. So the or is saying this is going to be the truthy value, and that's our default. All right. So the very simple person class, we have a constructor here. We're using the new keyword, so we have to use the new keyword with classes. And we have new person P, and we can run that and just see how that looks. Let's go node 5 classes. So there's our person object, and it's John Doe, right? What happens in class is if you don't use the new keyword, it's different than the constructor functions. You actually get an error. Okay, so that is one advantage of using the classes. You'll get an error if you use it improperly, but you also can't use the other syntax that I showed you with constructor functions to not use the new keyword at all, right? So it's kind of up to you. So there are slight differences between the two systems. Okay, so let's take a look at this. Let's add in our print function that we've been using this whole time. So if you don't understand what this print function is doing, first you probably should. You might want to go back and brush up on your JavaScript if you don't understand this, but we've been using it in the other videos and I explained it early on. So the idea is we're just iterating through all the properties of this particular object. Okay, and then you have the value at that property, the type, right? And then for all the functions, we're going to go ahead and call the functions because most of the functions are getters, except print. We don't want to call that because then that would be a recursive loop. So any functions that we don't want to call and print out, we add it to this list. Then we check to see if the type is a function, right? And then basically if it's in that list, we just set the value equal to this. And if it's not, then we actually call the function. All right, pretty basic stuff. So that's our print function. And what we want to do is just grab several of these people objects. Okay, so I'm going to make a few of them and put them in an array, basically. Okay, so we have let people, and then person Alice, person Bob, and then this is a new person. And what we want to do is for each one of those, we can print. Okay. First, last, Alice, Doe. So we only had Alice, we had no last name, right? Doe. Now we did have this print method in here, okay? And notice the way we define this print method. It's just a function inside of the person class, okay? So notice when we iterate over people, we do p.print, and print is iterating over each property in this particular object. Now what's happening here is because of inheritance, we're going to talk about inheritance coming up, certain properties are not an object's own properties. They are part of the inheritance chain. They are part of the prototype chain. Okay, so it has access to these properties, but they're not its own properties. So in this case, print is what's called a prototype property, and the object itself only has these two properties. Otherwise, we would see print and function being displayed here in the output. All right, so we don't see that. So that should tell us something interesting that we haven't necessarily learned about is going on. Now that's also part of the problem with classes is the way they've been implemented is it's kind of nice, they work well, but if you don't know what's going on, this type of thing would be hard for someone to understand, right? Why is this property that's clearly a part of the object not on my object? Okay. And it has to do with how JavaScript actually works using the prototype chain, and class programming in JavaScript is syntactic sugar over the top of that. And so if you don't know how it works underneath, under the hood, then you're going to have problems understanding classes. And so that's what we're going to go to next. We're going to talk about class inheritance next, closures and scoped, and then closures and scopes, and then closure-based encapsulation. So and then also some prototypes. So there's still quite a lot to get to in objects. So we're going to be moving into that next. All right. But first, for now, let's go through and run this. And for each of the people, we already ran it. So we've got each of the people here. We want to see this own property idea. Okay. So I want to introduce you to the concept of a prototype. A prototype is an object that you can attach to an object that you're creating, a constructor function, and by default, all the new object that you create will have those properties and those values. That's what a prototype is. And JavaScript is based on prototypal inheritance. Okay, and this is how you do that. We have every object, we have a class in this case, which is really just an object. It turns into a constructor function, right? Person.prototype, we can print that out. And the prototype is what has these two functions on it, okay? Now we're going to dig more into this. The main thing I want you to recognize is prototypal inheritance is the fundamental way JavaScript works. It's not classical inheritance. This classical structure is just over the top of the prototypal inheritance. All right, and then another important thing to look at is whenever you have a JavaScript object, you might want to serialize that. Sometimes they call this marshalling. The idea of serialization is you want to convert it. You have some digital structure in ones and zeros in memory, but you might want to send that over the wire, send it over the internet, and so you want to convert it to characters first. Now we could send binary data over the wire, that's fine, but it's kind of nice to send text data because then when you get it, you can read it right away if you are inspecting it with some sort of tool. If I'm using a tool to test out different endpoints, I can access the endpoint and I get the data blob back, and it's not binary. If it's string based, then I can look at it and read it and be sure that it's right. Okay, so it's kind of a nice way to transfer information in a way that is visual without having to have some other programmatic piece on the other end to decode it so you can actually see what you've got, right? So one of the ways to serialize objects is using this global JSON object .stringify method. Okay, so this JSON object is attached to the global object JSON.stringify. We can pass in the first person, which should be Alice Doe, and then this would be a function, optionally be a function that will go through and filter different properties or modify them. And then this is how many spaces of indentation you want to use in the string output. So remember, this is producing a string, so the indentation is actual space characters. So you have to specify how many you want, right? And so we can run this, and then there we see all the stuff printed out. This is the prototype, and then we see 1, 2, 3, 4, right? All right, and these are just strings. Now we can do the opposite of this, and we can take a stringified object and get a person back. So let Alice2, and we can say JSON.parse. And we want to parse what we just converted into a string. So let's modify this just a little bit. We want let Alice has a string. All right, and then Alice has a string. We print that out, and we can also print out, you know, the type of. That's a keyword, not a function. Alice string. So this should show you that it is indeed a string, and then we have Alice2, which we're going to take the string and parse the string and get an object back. Okay, so we're going to get this Alice2 object back, but the input to JSON.parse is going to be the stringified version of an object. So we get the string version with stringify, and that's what we can send across the internet, across the wire, and then we'll get the object version back. All right, and so here's the stringified version, and that is a string, and I didn't print out Alice2, so we'll do a console.dir of Alice2. Okay, and so that's, you see we have the same thing, but this is the programmatic version of the object. This is stored in memory in binary form. This is a string-based representation. That's all just characters. And so we can send the string-based representation over the internet. And this is a very common way of exchanging information with web applications. Very, very commonly, they'll use this JSON format, JavaScript object notation, right? And it's basically a way of structuring data, sending some information in a way that's readable, so I don't have to have programs on either end to decode the information. Now, if you have a lot of data, obviously this is not a good idea, but for little tiny endpoints, for example, when you need to go and get a user information or something like that, you log in and you send a little JSON with the username and then the hash password or something like that. And then you get some information back with the, you know, all the user information you need for the initial screen, right? Something like that. So little blobs of information, not gigantic, huge amounts of data. Okay, and then the other thing to note with JSON.stringify is, again, the only properties that it included were these ones that were actually defined in the constructor with this dot first, right? The functions here were not included on the object. So if that's something that you did want, JSON.stringify does not do that by default. Okay. All right, so that's classes. That's enough for now. There's still quite a bit more to objects, and we'll get into that in the next videos. Thanks for watching.